WuDon broke through the crystallized floor of the grove of Sunyani, the way a tooth breaks through a gum slowly, with pressure and with blood. Her palms came first. They were raw. The skin had split along the lines her grandmother Apoka used to read when WuDon was small, tracing the creases with a calloused thumb and murmuring futures into the child's open hand. Those lines were open now, seeping, the flesh beneath them the deep red brown of laterite exposed by rain. The crystallized ground parted around her wrists and forearms with a sound like wet clay separating, and then her head emerged, and she gasped not for air, but for scale. The guardian's chamber had been vast in the way that depth is vast, pressing inward. The grove was vast in the way that sky is vast, opening outward, and the transition between the two cramped something behind her sternum that took several breaths to unknot. The amber fruit sat against her breastbone, cold now. Not warm the way it had been when she bit into it, and the world dissolved downward. Cold the way a river stone is cold after you pull it from the water, holding the memory of a different temperature, a different medium. She pressed her hand to it through the cloth of her smock and felt its pulse, slower than before, the rhythm of something that had spent itself carrying her back and was resting now. The guardian's last message still rang in the bones of her inner ear. Bring the rejected one, bring the pattern, the cage breaks at Damba. The grove light stung. 3 days in amber darkness had made her eyes forget what sun looked like when it passed through crystal, and the effect was a shimmering migraine that turned the transformed trees into smears of gold. She blinked until the shapes resolved. Her body catalogued its new damages the way her grandmother used to catalog storm damage to the compound, methodically, without complaint. Blood had dried in a crust beneath both nostrils. A fine tracery of burst capillaries mapped her forearms where the sealed layer's pressure had squeezed her through stone. Her knees ached with the deep, mineral cold of earth that had held her weight for 3 days, and her hands felt oldest of all. They felt like they had been pressing against something for centuries and had only just been allowed to stop. Samini was exactly where she had left him. He sat against the boundary tree with his petrified staff across his knees, and 3 days had written themselves on his face in gray. The hollows beneath his eyes had deepened. His cheeks carried the ashen undertone she had first noticed after he broke the contact prohibition, but worse now, settled into the skin the way wood smoke settles into cloth, not a color laid on top, but a color absorbed into the weave. He smelled of sleeplessness, of the particular sweat that fear produces, sharper than exertion, metallic at the edges, of shea butter gone stale on unwashed skin. He saw her and his mouth opened and no sound came out. He tried again.
WuDon.
Her name broke him. The composure that had held through oath-breaking and root-road revelation, and the shattering of everything the circle had taught him, it cracked on the second syllable of her name, and the old Tindana who had corrected her posture 400 times and reminded her that communion was not a performance, pressed his forehead against his staff and wept. The sound was small, private, the sound of a man who had been bargaining with ancestors for 3 days and had just learned the bargain was honored. She sat beside him. Her legs were shaking. She let them shake. I heard it. She said, "The guardian, it spoke in not words, in the body. I felt the message the way you feel weather changing." She pressed her split palms against her thighs. "Bring the rejected one. The cage breaks at Damba, 3 days." Samini wiped his face with the back of his hand. The gesture was so ordinary, so human, an old man clearing tears with the rough efficiency of someone who has cried before and knows the mechanics that it steadied her more than any words could have.
"The rejected one is in Iron Haven," he said. His voice was hoarse, but working again. "An enskinment candidate, someone the skin pushed away."
I can feel him. She pressed her palms to the crystal ground, and the root lines flared beneath her touch, brighter than before, responding to her with a recognition that made her stomach tighten. Through the network, a shadow that reaches toward me the way a root reaches toward water, north-northwest, 3 days on foot.
"Too slow."
Too slow. She agreed. Nyariga spoke from the grove's center. She had not moved in 3 days, her crystallized body rooted to the network, her amber eyes monitoring frequencies that WuDon could only partially sense. Her voice was rough with disuse, the consonants catching on a dry throat.
The root road.
The words landed in the grove like a stone dropped into a calabash of still water. WuDon had heard the term once, in a fragment of oral history, so old Samini had prefaced it with "this may not be true." A way of traveling through the root line network. Node to node, grove to grove. Through the Earth's body, the way blood travels through veins.
The circle forbade it.
Samini said, but the protest was reflexive, the last twitch of a loyalty that had already died.
The circle forbade many things that kept them comfortable.
Nyariga's crystal palms pressed deeper into the grove floor. Root lines blazed outward in concentric rings, mapping the underground network in visible light. 47 nodes, bright threads connecting them, 4 dark gaps, and a path highlighted in brighter amber from Sunyani to Ironhaven, snaking through the root line architecture like a river drawn on a map of the Earth's insides.
6 hours through the roots. Your apprentice has the depth. The communion key will keep her anchored.
And me?
Samini asked.
You ride in her wake. Your depth is enough to follow, not to lead.
Samini looked at the path. He looked at WuDon. She watched him arrive at the same place he had arrived at every crossroads since the grove went silent, the place where caution met necessity and necessity won, and the old man who had spent his life teaching measured steps chose to leap. Show her,
he said to Nyariga, and then, quieter, to WuDon.
Come back to me.
The words hit her chest like a fist, not their meaning, their weight. The weight of a man who could not follow where she was going, who had trained her for depths he could not reach, who was now watching her prepare to become something that would leave him further behind with every step. A father watching his daughter walk into a country he would never visit. She reached for his hand and held it. His fingers were warm and rough and shaking, and she held them until the shaking stopped. I will come back, she said. I always come back. Nyariga taught her the root road in the language of the body. Not words, not theory. The exiled scholar placed her crystallized hand over WuDon's heart and pushed a frequency into her chest that reorganized her understanding of movement itself. The root lines were not paths to walk. They were currents to enter. The technique was not navigation, but surrender, letting the network's flow take the body the way a river takes a leaf, while the communion key maintained the self that the river would otherwise dissolve. WuDon practiced the entry 3 times on a short stretch of root line within the grove. Each time was worse than the last. The first attempt, the root line opened beneath her palms and pulled her down 6 inches before she panicked and wrenched herself free. The sensation was compression. Total, uniform, boneless compression, her body becoming a frequency, her bones vibrating at a pitch that made her teeth sing, the crystal ground squeezing her the way hands squeeze water from cloth. She surfaced gasping, spitting grit that tasted of chalk and iron. The second attempt, she went deeper. A foot, 2 feet. The compression intensified until she could not tell where her body ended and the earth began, and for one terrible moment, she understood what Nyariga had become, a woman who had gone so deep the boundary between self and stone dissolved, and had stayed because coming back meant finding the boundary again, and the boundary was gone. WuDon clawed her way up with the communion key blazing against her breastbone, anchoring her to the concept of surface, and when she emerged there was mineral grit in her teeth, and her skin felt pressed, flattened, as though she had been folded and unfolded. The third attempt, she let go. She stopped fighting the compression and let it have her. Her body became vibration. Her bones became frequency. The root line took her laterally 10 feet, 20, the length of the grove, and for 3 seconds she was inside the Earth's nervous system, moving at the speed of geological signal, seeing nothing and everything at once. Not light, not dark. The perception of structure without sight, root line junctions flaring as she passed, nodes pulsing in acknowledgement, the network recognizing the communion key, and clearing a path the way a crowd clears a path for a chief's procession. She surfaced at the grove's edge, fell to her hands and knees, vomited.
The taste was bile and minerals and copper. Her skin felt compressed, every pore sealed with stone dust, her joints aching as though they had been disassembled and reassembled slightly wrong. The grit between her teeth was real fragments of the root line substrate, carried in her mouth like sand carried in a river's current. She spat, wiped her lips with the back of her hand, breathed again.
Nyariga said, "No." WuDon said, "I understand it now. Practicing more will not make it less terrible." She stood, her legs held, barely. 6 hours of that.
6 hours.
Nyariga confirmed. No sympathy in the crystal voice. Only the precision of someone who had lived inside the network for 3 years and understood its costs the way a farmer understands drought, not as tragedy but as fact.
Samini helped her to the center of the grove. His hands on her shoulders were careful, the touch of a man handling something more fragile than it appeared. He smelled of fear. She loved him for coming anyway. "When you arrive," he said, "your body will feel wrong. The root road compresses everything: bone, blood, the spaces between cells. You will be nauseous, disoriented. Your skin will feel like it was ironed flat. Give yourself time to expand."
How do you know this?
"Because I have been reading the forbidden texts since Nyariga's exile."
A pause. The guilt in it was old and worn, like a path walked too many times.
"I should have read them sooner."
She knelt at the grove's center. The crystal ground chimed once beneath her knees, a clear tone that traveled through the network like a bell announcing departure. She placed her palms on the surface, felt the root lines open beneath her, felt the current waiting, patient and vast, ready to carry her north-northwest to a city she had never seen and a stranger whose shadow was already reaching for her through the dark. Samini knelt beside her. His communion wrapped around hers, not deep enough to lead, but steady enough to follow. Master and apprentice. The last time this arrangement would make sense, because what waited in Ironhaven would change what those words meant. "Ready," she told the earth. The root road took her. Not gently. The entry was a swallowing the ground, opening around her like a throat, compressing her body into vibration, squeezing her through stone the way a birth canal squeezes a child into light, except this was the opposite direction. This was being swallowed into dark, into pressure, into the humming infrastructure of a world she had only ever touched from above. The communion key blazed against her chest. Her bones sang. The grit filled her mouth, immediately mineral, chalky, tasting of every stratum she passed through, and she clenched her teeth against it and moved. The network unfolded around her like a map made of sensation. She could not see sight had no meaning here, in a medium that was neither solid nor liquid nor air, but something older than all three. She perceived. Root line junctions flared as she passed each node, a pulse of warmth, a burst of scent. One smelled of rain on hot stone, another of shea blossoms, another of something animal and musky that she did not recognize. A momentary easing of the compression as the network's architecture widened at the intersections and narrowed again between them. The groves that still lived greeted her with sound. Not words, chords. Each grove a different harmonic, the personality of the Tindana who had maintained it encoded in the root line's resonance, preserved in the network's memory like a voice preserved in the grain of a talking drum. She passed through the chord of a grove that tasted of wood smoke and palm wine, through another that smelled of wet clay and riverweed, through a third that carried the specific harmonic of grief, a grove whose Tindana had died and whose root lines still sang the morning frequency. Unheard, unacknowledged, a funeral that no one had attended. The dark nodes were different. When the root road carried her through a crystallized grove, one of the four, where the Zagale had surfaced, the compression eased entirely, and she floated through a space that was neither underground nor above it, but between, a liminal zone where the boundary between the Guardian's world and the surface had dissolved. In these spaces, the Guardian's presence was palpable, a vast attention brushing against her communion, the way a whale's flank brushes against a diver. Brief, overwhelming, gone. Samini followed in her wake. She could feel him, a steady warmth behind her, his petrified staff's ancient resonance adding a bass note to the communion key's treble anchor. He was struggling. She could feel that to the old man's body compressing less willingly than hers, his joints protesting the Rutrode's pressure with a stiffness that slowed him at the narrow stretches. But he held. The discipline of 40 years held. In 6 hours, the Rutrode deposited them in Ironhaven, the way the earth vomits a stone with force, with finality, and with the unmistakable sense that the medium was glad to be rid of them. WuDon hit the surface on all fours. Her palms struck packed earth, real earth, not crystal, dry and gritty and warm with the afternoon sun, and she retched. Nothing came up. Her stomach had been empty since the grove, but her body tried, heaving with the desperate conviction that something needed to be expelled, that 6 hours of compression had left material inside her that did not belong. Her skin felt ironed. Samini had been right. Every inch of her felt pressed flat, sealed, the pores closed with stone dust, the fine hair on her arms lying flat as though a great hand had smoothed it down. Grit packed her teeth. She ran her tongue across them and tasted chalk and iron and the mineral signature of every stratum the Rutrode had carried her through. Her joints ached with the memory of disassembly. Her eyes watered in the sudden light. She stood, the world tilted, steadied, tilted again. She waited it out the way she waited out the dizzy spells that came after deep communion, patient, breathing, trusting her body to remember which way was up. Ironhaven spread before her, and the scale of it hit her like a hand across the face. She had never been to a city.